There's something about unsolved mysteries that keep our attention for decades, especially when they involve missing people or dangerous fugitives that might just still be out there.
Getting a job in the mafia is always a dangerous prospect. It's generally a job for life, as in you could totally lose your life because of your job. But the fates of some gangsters are a little less clear, like the following who vanished and were never found. In 1921, Chicago gangster Thomas O'Connor was on death row in the Cook County Jail, sentenced to hang for killing a police officer. 4 days before the scheduled execution, he escaped by getting a hold of a pistol and threatening a guard. He then stole a car and was never seen again. There were plenty of theories about what happened to him. Some of them include returning to his native Ireland to fight the British, fleeing to Mexico, or becoming a Trappist monk. But there's a grave in Illinois reputed to be his that claims that he died in 1951. O'Connor's disappearance was a problem for Chicago. Cook County discontinued hanging and moved on to the electric chair in 1927. But Terrible Tommy's sentence specified that he was to be hanged. That meant if he ever turned back up, he couldn't legally be killed any other way. So just in case, the gallows gathered dust in a basement until 1977, when the county finally gave up on killing O'Connor, who would have been 96 by that point. Maybe he ended up like Robert De Niro at the end of The Irishman.
I ain't going nowhere.
Anthony Zizzo's 5'3" height earned him the nickname Little Tony, although he managed to pack 200 pounds on that small frame. He was a member of the Chicago Outfit, the Italian-American mafia in that city. In 2006, a major mob trial was about to begin, but Zizzo conspicuously wasn't charged. There's a theory that this may have made him look like a snitch. He was also in the middle of an intense beef with the powerful gangster Michael Sarno over a video poker machine business, so it wasn't that surprising when he suddenly vanished. On August 31st, Zizzo left his house telling his wife he had a business meeting. He stopped for gas and went to a restaurant where he was seen by numerous employees, though he never made it inside. His car was later found in the parking lot, but without Zizzo. There was no sign of foul play. His wife filed a missing persons report, and the FBI eventually offered $10,000 for information. Many people think that he was murdered either by his own crew for the rumors he'd snitched to the government or by his nemesis Sarno. One mob expert suspects he was probably killed and his body was disposed of in a way that would make it nearly impossible to locate. Sarno, for his part, swears that he had nothing to do with Zizzo's disappearance, and the FBI thinks it's possible that Zizzo went on the run to avoid possible prosecution. In mid-20th century New York City, garbage collecting was one of the Cosa Nostra's main rackets.
I'm in the waste management business. Everybody immediately assumes you're mobbed up.
In 1957, a Senate committee revealed that fruit peddler turned gangster Vincent James Squilanti was considered the absolute czar of Greater New York's private sanitation industry.
I have recently been placed in charge of garbage. Do you have any that requires disposal?
But Squilanti wasn't just on the business side of things. That same year, he was alleged to have ordered his goons to kill a guy and cut him up into tiny pieces, as reported by another Senate committee. Being investigated by the Senate is never a good sign, as it means the law is onto you. In 1960, Squilanti was indicted on extortion charges. On September 23rd, he was last seen driving a new Chevrolet car, and then he vanished. He may have been murdered by the mob for personal misconduct or so that he couldn't squeal at a trial. While no one knows for sure what happened to him, there's a rather disturbing rumor that says he was stuffed into a car, which was then placed into a crusher and was melted down in an open furnace with Squilanti still inside. Anthony Strollo, aka Tony Bender, was the right-hand man of New York mob boss Vito Genovese for many years. He was placed in charge of operations when his boss had to flee to Europe in the 1930s, and he ordered more murders than possibly any other mobster. Being Strollo's friend didn't mean much. In one instance, Genovese made sure Strollo wasn't involved in a hit since the target was Strollo's best friend, but Strollo cheerfully volunteered to help when he found out about the plans. Years later, he tried to kill another friend as well. Strollo's loyalty was just as flexible as his friendships. He tended to align himself with whomever had the most power at the time. In 1958, he switched families and set up his old boss Genovese in a drug bust. Genovese went to jail, where he realized Strollo had betrayed him. On April 8, 1962, Strollo left his home, telling his wife he would be gone for only a few minutes. He was never seen again. There are rumors that he's under New York's West Side Highway, or that his body was dumped in a cement mixer and became part of a skyscraper. When Genovese was asked why Strollo had vanished, he vaguely alluded to ordering his death, saying that it had been a kindness and Strollo wouldn't have been able to handle prison. By the time Frederick Tenuto was 16, he already had a criminal record, but his continuous trips to prison weren't that big a deal to him, as he was extremely good at breaking out. While he wasn't an important mobster, he got the nickname Angel of Death because he was the go-to guy if you wanted a hit done. He was even added to the FBI's most wanted list in 1950, but his carelessness would be his downfall. Albert Anastasio was a mafia don whose answer to everything was violence and killing. When a man named Arnold Schuster did his civic duty and turned in a bank robber in 1952, Anastasia announced that he hated squealers and ordered Schuster killed. The job fell to Tenuto. He did the deed in the open on a New York street, and there was at least one witness. When Anastasia heard his triggerman had been seen, he panicked. Tenuto could be connected to him, so he ordered his hitman killed to clean up the messy situation. Tenuto vanished, almost certainly because he'd been killed, though his body was never found. Some police informants say that he'd been given a double-decker funeral in which a body is placed in a false bottom underneath a different corpse. Abraham Bo Weinberg entered the world of organized crime as a young man, and by the time Prohibition rolled around, he was working for major New York bootlegger Dutch Schultz. Weinberg rose to be his right-hand man, personally killing many of Schultz's competitors and running his empire when Schultz went on the run to avoid tax evasion charges. But the feds were getting close, and this concerned Weinberg. If his boss fell, he risked losing it all. So Weinberg conspired with rival Lucky Luciano. He gave the other mob boss tips on how to bring down his current don in exchange for a cut of any future action. But before Luciano could move in and take over, Schultz found out about Weinberg's betrayal. On September 9, 1935, Weinberg left a friend's house, got in a car, and was never seen again. While one story says that Schultz killed his betrayer with his bare hands, a different tale of his death is the one that went down in history. After being beaten almost senseless, Weinberg's feet were encased in cement and he was dumped in the East River while still alive. America wasn't the only place that banned alcohol for a time. The Ontario Temperance Act of 1916 was pretty much a blanket ban against booze, which led to some north-of-the-border gangsters involved in bootlegging, including a mobster named Rocco Perry. One night in 1923, Perry was on the scene as more than 2,500 bottles of whiskey were unloaded from a boat. The cops busted him, but he swore that he was just in the area and had nothing to do with it. The charges were eventually dropped. A year later, he wasn't so shy about his work. In 1924, Perry confessed his illegal activities to a reporter, and his wife called him the king of the bootleggers. But he couldn't be charged with anything just for bragging. On April 23, 1944, Perry got a headache while visiting a cousin. He went for a walk to try and shake it, saying that he'd be back by lunch, but he never returned. There's a theory that he was killed by underworld rivals for control of his territory and dumped in the Hamilton Harbor, but there's some evidence that he might have learned about a plot to kill him and fled. Perry's biographer claims to have proof that he lived in Messina, New York under a different name until he died of natural causes in 1953. Paolo Renda was right in the middle of Canada's violent underworld. In the 1970s, Niccolo Rizzuto took over the mafia in Montreal by killing another don. Renda married Rizzuto's daughter and got heavily involved in the family business, including handling the finances. Renda had numerous run-ins with the law, and things started to go south for his mob family in general. A rival gang began fighting them for power, sending messages that included kidnapping Rizzuto's gangsters, who would later reappear safe and sound. That wasn't the case for Renda. On May 20, 2010, while he was on conditional release from jail, a black car with a removable siren on top pulled the gangster over. Two men posing as plainclothes police officers bundled him into their car. Renda's wife discovered his SUV abandoned with the key still in the ignition. He was never seen again. The real police thought the hit might have been part of a vendetta dating back to the 70s. Normally, it takes 7 years to declare someone dead when they vanish, but Renda's wife tried to get closure in 2013. The judge rejected her petition, though, saying that there wasn't enough proof that he'd been killed. Joseph Artizzoni was a man of many faces. He was an immigrant fruit peddler just trying to make a living in turn-of-the-century Los Angeles. He was also a civic leader in the Italian community. But there was another sinister side to Artizzoni. In the early 20th century, two gangs emerged in LA, with Artizzoni heading one known as the Black Hand. Artizzoni's crew started killing people in the rival mob, and by 1906, he had to go on the lam. But soon he was back in LA and back to his old habits. When Prohibition rolled around, he got involved in bootlegging, and he kept killing people, although the law never got any charges to stick. But the violence of the liquor business caught up with Artizzoni. He wanted to muscle in on other gangs' bootlegging operations, and they wanted to take over his. He was shot in a drive-by in February 1931 and barely survived. Then in October, he went for a drive to go pick up a cousin, but never arrived. No one ever found out what happened to him. His wife had to wait years until he was officially declared dead. Other than having gobs of money, being a celebrity can't be easy. Sometimes people might be out to get you, or you just might want to vanish and stay gone. Was that what happened to these celebrities? We'll give you the facts and let you decide. Imagine if Lord Byron, Sid Vicious, and a moody teenager all managed to magically meld together and create a single person. That person would look and act a whole lot like Manic Street Preacher's rhythm guitarist and lyricist Richie Edwards, a mid-1990s British rock idol whom The Guardian called a lightning rod of sorts for adolescent angst. Edwards was handsome, moody, and dreamy, with a talent for writing lyrics about depression, and an even bigger talent for disturbing publicity stunts. When a journalist with music magazine NME implied his band's posturing was insincere, Edwards grabbed a razor blade and carved "for real" in his own arm. It's not surprising then that when he first went missing in February 1995, it could have just been interpreted as another chapter in his twin stories of self-destruction and self-promotion. However, it quickly became apparent that the young poet was gone for good. Edwards had been due to fly to the US with MSP frontman James Dean Bradfield when he disappeared from his hotel room. His car was later found abandoned near the Severn Bridge, which connects England and Wales. Edwards was legally declared dead in 2008, but no body has ever surfaced. Still, sightings of the musician have reached halfway across the world and all the way to Goa, India. And published in 2019, Withdrawn Traces, Searching for the Truth About Richie Manic, alleges that Edwards faked his own disappearance. Did he? It's looking more and more unlikely that we'll ever know. Here's some advice for any disappointed artists out there. Just because no one likes your stuff now doesn't mean people won't one day be discussing how underrated you are. Just look at Connie Converse. A 1950s musician, she's now considered the first modern singer-songwriter crooning intimate, lyrical ballads suffused with melancholy, long before anyone was talking about Bob Dylan. Not that her contemporaries were aware how groundbreaking Converse was. In 1961, she quit music altogether, unknown and convinced she was a failure. In a happier universe, Converse's tale would now take a redemptive turn. In 2009, a handful of songs she'd recorded in the kitchen of illustrator and audio engineer Gene Deitch were released by Deitch's record label. The album, How Sad, How Lovely, became a cult hit. The New Yorker profiled her. People realized she'd been amazing. Sadly, Converse saw none of this success because she disappeared in 1974. 74 was a bad year for Converse. She just turned 50 and she felt like a failure. That summer, she wrote to her friends that she was going to make a fresh start, loaded up her car, and drove off into legend. No trace of her has ever surfaced, and there's a chance she's out there, way into her old age, maybe even aware that her talent has finally been discovered. If Jim Sullivan's name isn't ringing any bells, that's because he's the definition of a cult artist. A folk rocker who was part of the LA scene in the 60s and early 70s, Sullivan cut just 2 records before heading to Nashville for what was meant to be his big break. He never made it. His car was found abandoned in the desert outside Santa Rosa, New Mexico. His wallet, clothes, and guitar were all found in a nearby motel. Of Sullivan himself, there was no trace. As record company Light in the Attic explained in its notes for the re-release of Sullivan's UFO album, he was a guy who should have been famous. Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew backed him on his first record. He had a small part in Easy Rider. Oh, and he was an excellent writer of depressed melancholy pop. Had he reached Nashville, he might be up there with the greats, but Sullivan never made it to Tennessee. As one of his friends said, Sullivan would have never left his guitar behind if he planned to vanish. Appropriately for a dude who released a record called UFO, which featured lyrics about driving into the desert and being abducted by aliens, one of the more prominent theories is that he was, you guessed it, abducted by aliens.
And like it was just going right across the sky, man, and then... it just suddenly, it just changed direction and went whizzing right off.
Barbara Newhoff Follett was a jazz-age writing prodigy. She published her first novel around age 13, something that's hard enough to do even when your novel is a self-published fan fiction. When that novel is The House Without Windows, a complex work that wins rave reviews in the New York Times, publishing it as a teenager is basically a miracle. Everyone who read the book agreed Follett was going to be the next great American writer. Follett did indeed vanish, but we're not quite to that part of the story yet, and that's not the reason you've never read any of her books. After putting out just 2 novels, Follett was forced to give up her writing when her father suddenly took off with a younger woman, leaving Follett and her mother penniless. By age 16, Follett was working as a typist and fending for herself. Then, in 1939, the then 26-year-old Follett had an argument with her husband and left the house. She never returned, and no trace of her was ever found. According to literary magazine Lampoon's Quarterly, her husband barely bothered to look for her, and the press wasn't alerted until 1966. By then, her disappearance was well into cold case territory. If you know Rico Harris, you probably know him for disappearing. The gentle giant vanished one night in 2014 somewhere along State Route 16 near Sacramento. The resulting manhunt gripped the press, but it only gripped them because Harris used to be somebody. In 2000, Harris played basketball for the Harlem Globetrotters, a team so famous that even people who know nothing about sports recognize the name. Before that, he'd been a top 100 college basketball recruit, but substance abuse and injury kept him from reaching his full potential, and he wound up out of basketball and working as a security guard in LA. The final blow came in 2014 when he was fired for drunkenness. He left his mom's LA house to drive to Seattle and stay with his girlfriend. His car was later found abandoned outside Sacramento. A 2017 profile in the LA Times recounts the strange details. Harris, who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, was known for disappearing for days on end and not taking his medication. This time, he was described as out of sorts. A backpack and phone that had taken a video of him were found on the roadside, but when police searched the wilderness using a heat vision camera, they found nothing. Human footprints were found in sand, and reports of a man walking down the highway trickled in, but Harris was never found. The LA Times suggests he was probably picked up as a hitchhiker. After that, who knows? Canadian band Loverboy was one of the biggest rock bands of the early 80s, with hard-charging hits like Hot Girls in Love and Working for the Weekend, which is still played on just about every radio station in the world every Friday afternoon. Scott Smith was a founding member, staying with the group all the way until his mysterious and frightening disappearance at sea on November 30th, 2000. After playing with his band in Vancouver, BC, at a benefit for the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, Smith, two friends, and his girlfriend set out for Mexico on a 37-foot sailboat. As they sailed down the coast and neared San Francisco, the weather got rough, with the seas throwing up gigantic waves. One of them, estimated to be about 20 feet high, knocked Smith off the deck of the vessel and into the water. Coast Guard helicopters arrived within 20 minutes and dispatched two search boats, which scoured a 133 square mile area to no avail. When fog and continuing high waves ended that search, Smith's family paid for a private search by a San Francisco company, and that too proved fruitless. Smith's remains have never surfaced. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is the guy who wrote The Little Prince, a children's book of such beauty, such power, and such simplicity that it's tempting to say no life can be declared complete until one has read it at least once. He was also a fanatical aviator and a death-defying acrobat of the skies who once crash-landed in the Libyan desert and spent a week wandering, lost and on the brink of death, before being miraculously found by a passing Bedouin. When World War II kicked off, Saint-Exupéry was desperate to do his bit for his native France. After the US entered the war, he volunteered his skills as a pilot. Unfortunately, aircraft tech had kinda moved on since his heyday, to the extent that the great writer was more hindrance than help. His second ever mission for the Allies, he managed to crash into an olive grove. On his sixth, he wound up landing on Corsica instead of Sardinia, a mistake that left him stranded for several days. It didn't help that he got drunk before some missions. In short, he was a liability. All of which may explain what happened on his 10th mission. On July 31st, 1944, Saint-Exupéry took off on a mission over the Mediterranean. He was never seen again. Although wreckage from his plane was recovered in 2000, no body has ever been identified. It's possible he survived the wreck, but it's probably more likely that he drowned.
To me, you will be unique in all the world. What is essential is invisible to the eye.
Theodosia Burr Alston might not be a household name these days, but let's put it this way. Imagine the chaos if Ivanka Trump one day just vanished. America got a taste of that back in 1813 when Alston, the daughter of former Vice President Aaron Burr, stepped onto a small boat docked in Georgetown, South Carolina, and was never seen again. At the time, Alston, who was married to a wealthy South Carolina plantation owner, was as infamous as her father. Burr's duel with Alexander Hamilton had been brought on in part by rumors that the VP and his daughter were engaging in some hot and heavy incestuous loving. Then, when Burr headed out west to establish his own breakaway nation, it was Alston who bankrolled his megalomania. When he was tried for treason, she was there, and when he fled the country, it was with her help. All of this came at a cost. Alston was known to be desperately unhappy and suffering from chronic ill health after the birth of her child. After her father left the country and her son died, she slipped into an inescapable funk. When she vanished, it didn't take long for the public to put two and two together and make approximately 5 billion conspiracy theories. The truth is probably more mundane than any of them. including the one that suggests she ran off to be a pirate. Alston was sailing through fierce storms on a trip up the coast from South Carolina to New York, and the schooner never arrived, making it likely that the ship went down in the storm. In the 2 decades before rock and roll took hold, big bands ruled the music world, and there were few as successful and well-known as the operation run by Glenn Miller. After working as an arranger and trombone player, Miller formed his own band and scored one jazzy, brassy, era-defining hit after another, racking up 17 top 10 hits in 1939 and 31 in 1940. World War II interrupted Miller's career. He joined the Air Force as an officer but still played war bond rallies and for his fellow military men. In 1944, the 40-year-old Miller took his act and his band to the UK, and on December 15th, he boarded a plane bound for Paris, where he was set to perform for troops. The small aircraft went up over the English Channel and was never seen again. According to Colorado Public Radio, conditions were bad that day, and it's possible that Miller's plane crashed into the English Channel after a malfunction caused by a frozen fuel intake line. While not a celebrity in the traditional sense, Jimmy Hoffa was incredibly famous as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the country's largest and most powerful labor unions. That made him well known. The crimes for which he was convicted made him notorious, as did alleged connections with the world of organized crime. After a 1965 conviction by a federal jury for taking funds from a trucking company and trying to funnel a bribe to a juror's son, Hoffa stepped down as Teamsters president, but he still held sway in the organization. On July 30, 1975, 61-year-old Hoffa called his wife from a suburban Detroit restaurant to tell her that his lunch appointment with 2 known organized criminals was off because the guys had failed to show up. That's the last time anybody heard anything from Hoffa. Where did he go? There's the disproven urban legend that mobsters killed him and then buried him in Giant Stadium in New Jersey. And there's also a theory presented to a grand jury that Hoffa was the victim of a professional hit because he planned to reveal that the mob had taken control of the Teamsters and was funneling pension money into various criminal activities. At this point, it's likely we may never know the truth. The Incredible String Band was possibly the most countercultural late 60s band in existence, combining the folky, hippie musical stylings popular in the era with psychedelic rock, which also resonated with young people at the time. Founded by Robin Williamson and Mike Herron, they added their respective girlfriends Christina Licorice McKechnie and Rose Simpson to the group and enjoyed some modest success on the lower runs of the Billboard album chart. That was thanks in part to the vocal and songwriting contributions of McKechnie, who bopped around on the fringes of the folk music scene in the 1970s. A native of Edinburgh, Scotland, McKechnie returned to the area in 1986 to visit relatives, and not long after, her whereabouts veered into the unknown. Her sister later suggested that McKechnie was in Sacramento recovering from surgery in 1990, while others had reported that McKechnie's last known sighting came when she was seen hitchhiking in the Arizona desert in 1987. Elenia Carisi was essentially already famous at the moment she was born in 1970. Her father, Albano Carisi, a popular Italian singer in the 1960s. In 1970, Albano married American singer-songwriter Romina Power, the daughter of mid-century movie superstar Tyrone Power, and they became a highly successful double act in Europe, as well as the parents of 2 kids, including Elenia. The younger Carisi made her entertainment debut in the 1984 Italian film Champagne in Paradiso before appearing in 1989 as a letter-turner on Italian's version of Wheel of Fortune. 5 years after that, the 23-year-old Carisi disappeared. Taking a sabbatical from the University of London to research a novel, Carisi visited Florida and the French Quarter of New Orleans. She left her passport and luggage behind and never returned. And although she was declared dead in 2014, there's been speculation that her disappearance was purposeful. Vancouver-based musician Forrest Schaub was a rapper who performed under the stage name DY, an ominous abbreviation of his nickname Die Young. He broke out big in 2009 and 2010, signed a deal with CP Records, released the hit club track Passenger, and toured Canada as an opening act for Akon. He was preparing to drop his second single, That's My Spot, and his first full-length album when, in August 2010, the 26-year-old rapper apparently flew from Toronto to Mexico. A few weeks later, he wished a friend happy birthday on his social media accounts, and that marked the last time Schaub would make contact with anyone. Schaub's family contacted the Toronto Police Service, whose search as to the rapper's whereabouts didn't turn up any viable leads. He remains missing today. A rising pop star in his native Chechnya and other North Caucasian states, Zelen Baka performed in Chechen and Russian and recorded popular songs like Nana and Without You. Then, in 2017, he was set to compete on the Russian version of Star Academy, a reality show hybrid of American Idol and Big Brother. Until that is, 25-year-old Bakov traveled to the Chechen capital city of Grozny on August 8, 2017. Local LGBT community advocates allege that within hours of arriving in his hometown, Bekov was arrested and was sent to a government facility where he was tortured and killed, a victim of the country's efforts to eradicate gay people in Chechnya. Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov publicly denied that his government had anything to do with Bekov's disappearance or possible death, suggesting instead that the singer's own relatives killed him because of his sexuality. Kadyrov said his family couldn't stop him and then called him back home, and his brothers, it seems, accused him. Isn't there anyone in the village, any man in the family who can admit, we did this? They know full well who it was. The singer's father, Kuzian Bekov, denied that this was the case and told Radio Free Europe none of his relatives laid a finger on him. There was no reason to lay a finger on him. Forward guard John Brisker moved up to the NBA in 1972 when he signed with the Seattle Supersonics. His numbers in the Moore Premier League weren't quite up to snuff with what was expected though, and he was cut from the Sonics in 1975. According to the Seattle Times, he went to Africa in 1978 to start up an import-export venture. On April 11, 1978, Brisker called his girlfriend from Uganda. Brisker was not seen or heard from again. It's possible he met his end in the violent coup that rocked Uganda that year. His former teammates entertained rumors that he was slaughtered and eaten by dictator Idi Amin, or that he angered the leader who then shot him. The U.S. State Department could not actually confirm if Brisker had ever traveled to Africa in the first place, but at any rate, in May 1985, the King County Medical Examiner in Seattle declared Brisker dead so that his estate could be settled. In 1939, the NCAA held its first ever men's college basketball tournament. The University of Oregon took home the win, and the champion players became minor celebrities, particularly towering star center Urgel Slim Wintermute. According to the Boston Globe, the All-American from Portland could dunk the ball, a novelty at the time. After college, Wintermute worked for airplane manufacturer Boeing in Seattle, married and fathered 3 children. In October 1977, the 60-year-old Wintermute took a boat out of Seattle-adjacent Lake Washington with a friend. Sometime after his companion went to sleep on the large boat, he left the craft and was never seen or heard from again. The athlete's son told police that his father was on medication for a heart issue and that he might have had a heart attack and fallen into the water. His remains were never recovered. In the 1930s, Amelia Earhart was an American hero and one of the most famous people on the planet, and with good reason. Earhart did amazing things with airplanes when aviation was still in its infancy, when the idea of humans flying by a mechanical means was all a delightful and inspiring novelty. In 1932, the National Women's History Museum says Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, unaccompanied, and she was awarded the Cross of the French Legion of Honor and the American Distinguished Flying Cross, among other achievements. In 1937, Earhart set out on a journey that would prove ambitious and mysterious. She aimed to be the first woman to fly all the way around the globe. Alongside her navigator, Fred Noonan, Earhart departed Miami on June 1st. By July 2nd, they'd made it to New Guinea with plans to hit Howland Island, a small uninhabited landmass between Hawaii and Australia. Sometime en route, Earhart, dealing with poor weather and low fuel, lost contact with the Coast Guard liaison. Her plane never landed, and it was never discovered. Nor were Earhart or Noonan, despite a joint Coast Guard and Navy search effort that encompassed 250,000 square miles. Her disappearance remains one of the most enduring mysteries of American history.
In case you weren't listening, I'm not one to shy away from danger.
How about Spears? You want to shy away from Spears?
Hart Crane was a modernist poet in the mold of T.S. Eliot, writing in a flowery, intellectual, often tortured style, and he similarly became an emerging and leading figure in early 20th century American poetry. He was also compared to Walt Whitman, and he earned accolades for The Bridge, a long near-epic poem ostensibly about the Brooklyn Bridge, but really about the idea of America itself. Crane's father, Clarence Arthur Crane, was a wealthy chocolatier and candy maker, and Crane had a tumultuous relationship with the man. In April 1932, after the elder Crane had died, the poet had reportedly grown depressed, according to friends who spoke to the New York Times. After winning a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and relocating to Mexico to write an epic poem about the 16th century conquest of Mexico, Crane boarded an ocean liner and was headed back to New York when, around noon one day, he either jumped into the Atlantic Ocean or fell. Crane, who was 32 at the time and reportedly struggling with his sexuality, did not leave a note, and his body never surfaced. In the late 90s and early 2000s, child and teen actor Joe Pickler appeared in a series of small and supporting roles in a number of movies and TV shows, including Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Touched by an Angel, Varsity Blues, and most notably in 2 direct-to-video sequels in the Beethoven family film franchise. And then he disappeared. According to The Charlie Project, Pickler spoke with a friend at about 4 a.m. on January 5, 2006, in his northeastern Washington hometown of Bremerton. It was a few weeks before his 19th birthday when he left his apartment untouched, unlocked, and with the lights on. He took only his wallet and car keys before he disappeared without telling anyone where he might be going. He left no clues behind aside from some poems that spoke to his depressed state. 4 days later, Pickler's Toyota Corolla was located in Bremerton, and authorities suspected that Pickler may have jumped to his death off of a bridge over Port Madison Narrows, but no evidence of that nor his remains were ever recovered. If you were alive in 1910, Dorothy Arnold's name would have been extremely familiar. The disappearance of the 25-year-old socialite was the news story of the year, mixing wealth, scandal, and mystery into a single hyperactive news cocktail. A prominent celeb in New York City, Arnold vanished in the middle of Central Park in broad daylight. The subsequent case saw her star profile go supernova. The details of the case read like the pitch for hard-boiled detective drama. Things weren't going smoothly at home. Arnold had fallen out with her millionaire father, who refused to let her move out of the house. She kept a secret post office box no one knew about, possibly connected to her writing career. She was having a fling with a man 20 years her senior, George Griscom Jr., and had recently pawned her jewelry after meeting him. Then she went shopping one day and never returned. Arnold's rich dad was so worried about the bad publicity his disappearing daughter might bring that he didn't tell the police for months. He had hired his own gumshoes to investigate, and they turned up squat. There were rumors Arnold had been murdered by Griscom, rumors she'd committed suicide, and rumors she died in a botched backstreet abortion. Over a century later, no one is the wiser. Planes, ships, and souls have vanished there without a trace, and the Bermuda Triangle continues to haunt imaginations more than 200 years after the first recorded disappearance. So what's really going on in the Devil's Triangle? Here's the one that really started it all. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, Flight 19, consisting of 5 Avenger bombers and 14 aviators, took off from the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They were to conduct a bombing exercise, fly over the Bahamas, and return home.
It was a routine training flight. All of the pilots had several hundred hours in various types of planes.
To add to that, the group's commander, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, was a seasoned pilot who'd flown numerous missions during World War II. But as they turned north toward Grand Bahama Island, the group got lost. Then a storm rolled in, making navigation even more confusing. A nearby Navy officer, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, heard Flight 19's radio call. Lieutenant Taylor said his compasses were malfunctioning, and he was certain the group had flown far off course, closer to the Florida Keys.
At the same time, would be a very rare occurrence.
The squadron was advised to fly west toward the setting sun, but Taylor, perhaps thinking he was over the Gulf of Mexico, directed the group to fly east, then turn west. Eventually, they lost radio contact.
We couldn't believe it. How could 5 of our qualified pilots be missing all at one time?
In Flight 19's last known radio transmission, the communication pretty much summed up the situation. No one's exactly sure who said it, but it's recorded as being, "It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." No evidence of the missing squadron was recovered. It's likely that they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean, but the unresolved fate of Flight 19 remains one of the most famous mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. Great Isaac Key in the Bahamas is a tiny island that, since 1850, has been home to the Great Isaac Lighthouse. Today, the lighthouse is automated, but back in the 1960s, it was still operated by lighthouse keepers. On August 4, 1969, a supply team arrived at the lighthouse to discover that the keepers had vanished without a trace, leaving everything in order. One theory was that Hurricane Anna, which had passed through the area days earlier, swept the unfortunate keepers away in a massive wave. Drugs and arms trafficking had been reported in the area, so another theory was that the keepers had been involved and somehow met a grisly end. Or maybe they sailed off to get ahead of the law, or the criminal element. And again, perhaps they were victims of paranormal activity. Lighthouse ghosts are a thing, and there were rumors about the ghost of a drowned 19th century woman wandering about the place. Whatever really happened, there's been no evidence of the missing lighthouse keepers or their fate to this day. In March 1918, the USS Cyclops was one of the largest ships in the US Navy, carrying a crew of 306. Originally built to carry bulk shipments of coal, on its final voyage, the Cyclops was loaded down with 11,000 tons of manganese, vital to the US steel industry and war effort. The Cyclops picked up the ore in Brazil and then stopped in Barbados because sailors had noticed that the water level on the heavily loaded ship was too high. The Cyclops stocked up with fuel and supplies for the final push and left Barbados on March 4th. They were due in Baltimore on March 13th, but never arrived. Their last known communication was that the weather looked fine and everything was going as expected.
The ship was last seen by a British patrol off of Barbados in perfect condition. just hours before it disappeared.
So what happened? Maybe a storm sunk the overloaded ship, or previous loads of coal had corroded the ship's structure. There's even some thought that the crew mutinied. All we know for sure is that the Cyclops never arrived in Baltimore, and no trace of it or its cargo has ever been found. For the 29 passengers on the December 28, 1948 flight between San Juan, Puerto Rico and Miami, Florida, it seemed like a normal trip. But somewhere over the Atlantic, the chartered Douglas DST airliner, often referred to as Airborne Transport DC-3, went missing. According to a 1949 accident report issued by the Civil Aeronautics Board, Captain Robert Lindquist and his crew experienced trouble even before takeoff, including a malfunctioning warning light and low batteries. Lindquist also noted issues with radio communications. He could receive but not transmit messages. Lindquist took off anyway, believing the plane's generators would recharge the batteries mid-flight, and that would solve the transmitter issue. At first, it looked like he was right. Lindquist radioed that he was 50 miles from Miami, but the transmission was received in New Orleans. Maybe Lindquist was so far off course because he hadn't received reports of wind changes that could dramatically affect navigation. We'll never know, because the plane never arrived anywhere. Despite a search that extended into the Gulf of Mexico, no wreckage was ever found, and no one was able to conclusively determine what happened to the airliner, its crew, or the 29 lost passengers. The Star Tiger and Star Ariel were British passenger liners that disappeared in January 1948 and January 1949, respectively. They were flying routes that took them from London to Bermuda, while the Star Ariel was also bound for Kingston, Jamaica. Both disappeared mid-flight with little warning. The Star Tiger carried 25 passengers and 6 crew members, while the Star Ariel had 20 aboard.
Was this converted bomber fit to carry passengers? Or were Avro Tudors fatally flawed?
In a 1948 accident report, the British Ministry of Civil Aviation noted that the Star Tiger had had numerous issues, including a faulty cabin heater and one malfunctioning compass. Captain Brian W. McMillan elected to fly at a dramatically low altitude, possibly to alleviate the heater issue. He appears to have overloaded the craft with fuel and passengers, which meant the Star Tiger would have burned fuel much faster. And as close as they were to the water, if there was an emergency, the plane would likely hit the ocean's surface in mere seconds. Just a year later, the Star Ariel disappeared in a much higher altitude of about 18,000 feet.
She was in good mechanical condition. She had an experienced pilot, an experienced crew, and the weather was fine.
An investigation ruled out fuel issues, weather, and pilot error, but former BSAA pilots told the BBC that the cabin heater and hydraulic systems were in close proximity. Leaking hydraulic fluid or fumes could have come into contact with the heater and caused a sudden explosion. And again, it's just a theory. The Revenant, which disappeared on January 2, 1958, was a 43-foot racing yawl with a crew of 5. That means it's a sailboat with 2 masts in the family of yachts. The crew included experienced sailors like owner Harvey Conover. The ship's name was actually Conover spelled backwards.
Harvey Conover Sr. was one of the most trophied yachtsmen in the world.
Conover, his wife, their adult son Larry and his wife Mary, and friend William Flugelman all set out from Key West. Their apparent goal was to dock in Miami, though others suggested that they were actually trying to make it to Nassau, in the Bahamas. Wherever they were headed, something went terribly wrong. By the afternoon of Thursday, January 2nd, weather stations were warning of a gale with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Later, gusts of more than 70 miles per hour were recorded around Miami. Meanwhile, the Revenant failed to appear as expected.
They had a receiver, but not a transmitter.
He couldn't radio anyone when they got into trouble.
No.
After a 2-day search, the ship's dinghy was found about 80 miles north of Miami, half sunk and with no sign of the crew. A passing shrimp boat reported seeing 5 people trailing from ropes behind a foundering craft, but immense waves, strong winds, and a malfunctioning motor meant they couldn't attempt to rescue. This was likely the last known sighting of the doomed ship and its crew. By 1965, the Yankee route was a popular flight path across the Atlantic just south of Florida. Yet while many aircraft have traveled through the region without incident, that wasn't the case for the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar piloted by Major Louis Giuntoli on June 5th of that year. Giuntoli, along with 9 other members of the 440th Airlift Wing, was set to arrive at Grand Turk Island in the Bahamas that evening. It was a fairly boring trip, just dropping off an engine and maintenance crew in Grand Turk, hopping over to Puerto Rico to pick up a load of concertina wire, and dropping that off at a base in the Dominican Republic. Yet, after a routine communication, the C-119 seemingly flew into oblivion. When it didn't arrive at Grand Turk, a massive search kicked off. Searchers did find part of the missing airplane, but it was a scant collection of debris and a single wheel that offered little clue as to how the plane went down. Some thought it was strange that little else was found, as the sort of sudden explosion that might have caught a crew of experienced airmen unawares would have likely left more evidence. On December 24, 1967, wealthy Miami hotel owner Dan Burrick and Father Patrick Hogan took Burrick's 23-foot craft Witchcraft just off Miami Beach to see the holiday lights. But what was meant to be a quick, fun trip soon turned into an emergency. At around 9 p.m., Burrick contacted the Coast Guard to report the Witchcraft in distress. He claimed that the powerboat had hit an unidentified object and was unable to navigate. He also specified that the Witchcraft was near buoy number 7 in the harbor, theoretically making it easier for help to locate them. But when the Coast Guard arrived 18 minutes later to give the two men a ride back to shore, they found only empty water, even though they were just a mile or so off the beach, well within sight of Miami.
Something's wrong. It's almost like something picked it up and took it away.
Even stranger, the boat was reportedly designed with flotation gel that made it unsinkable, and would have, at worst, kept it just below the surface, well within sight of rescuers. Despite a massive search that included 6 planes and 4 U.S. military ships, no sign of either man or their boat was found.
Buoy 7 falls right just barely inside the western tip of the Bermuda Triangle, so a lot of people think the Bermuda Triangle got them.
Where could they have gone in such a short time? Perhaps the boat wasn't as unsinkable as Burrick believed, or maybe one or both of the men got involved with some unsavory characters. And there's yet another possibility.
I think it was a ruse that he radioed into the Coast Guard and he was never there.
Perry Cohen and Austin Stefanos were last seen on July 24, 2015 when they left Jupiter, Florida in a 19-foot boat. Though both boys were only 14 years old, their families said that Cohen and Stefanos often went fishing and boating. But this time, the pair met bad weather that apparently capsized the boat. The vessel was found about 67 miles north of Daytona Beach, but was pushed out to sea before retrieval. Later, a Norwegian ship came across it, this time about 100 miles from Bermuda. The ship's captain told CBS 12 that the boat was in one piece with a complete hull, a seemingly unaffected engine, and Stefanos' iPhone inside. Other sources reported that the battery and boat ignition were switched off. Cohen's family had apparently set limits on his seafaring activity, and the unauthorized trip had caused a major rift between the families. Testimony from the boys' friends, including communications from that day, indicate that the two realized they were facing bad weather. Some suggested that Cohen and Stefanos were headed to the Bahamas. Other families argue against this, as the two didn't have passports or enough fuel to make the trip. And while Cohen and Stefanos weren't technically inside the commonly accepted bounds of the Bermuda Triangle, it's not entirely clear where they were headed. Their course, intentional or otherwise, may have taken them into the region. Some criminals face justice, some die for their crimes, and others just disappear off the face of the earth. D.B. Cooper just might be the most infamous missing criminal of all time. The basic story is that in 1971, Cooper boarded a flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle. He handed the flight attendant a note that claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase, and you know the story from there. He jumps out of the plane and into the annals of folklore forever.
There have been mysteries mankind cannot explain. But advances in
The first real lead in the case cropped up in 1980 when a young boy walking near the Columbia River found a bunch of $20 bills with serial numbers matching D.B. Cooper's ransom money. By then, though, the trail had long gone cold. In 2016, the FBI finally stopped looking for Cooper after one of the longest active searches in its history. The investigation got an unexpected shot in the arm a few years later. In 2020, 2 individuals, Shante and Rick McCoy III, handed the FBI a parachute that they had found in their shed. The 2 siblings have since claimed that D.B. Cooper was their father, Richard McCoy Jr., a man who had carried out another hijacking in 1972 and was later killed in a shootout with the FBI. The FBI appears to have taken their claims seriously, too. As of late 2024, the organization is seeking verification via DNA testing, using samples taken from both the parachute and the plane D.B. Cooper jumped from. If you're familiar with the case, you know there's a lot of problems with that parachute claim, but we'll save that for another video. The point is, we're really not any closer to solving the Cooper case than we were before. Situated in the middle of the freezing cold San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was once known as the place you put people if you wanted them to stay put. Over the course of 30 years, 36 escape attempts took place, and they mostly went really badly. 23 escapees were immediately caught, 6 were killed during capture attempts, and another 2 drowned. But 3 guys might just have made it. Their names were John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Frank Morris. They planned their escape well, using information from the prison library to learn how to build rafts. To make sure no one missed them on the night they tried to escape, they built papier-mâché heads to leave in their beds. And this worked too. The guards didn't notice anything was wrong until the next morning.
God damn it, Morris. I said get up. Jesus Christ.
The 3 escapees squeezed through a cement wall and used pipes to make it up onto the roof, where they then shimmied down a smokestack. They then constructed a raft using 50 raincoats, grabbed driftwood for paddles, and headed to freedom across the bay. Or did they? It's certainly possible the 3 prisoners left at just the right time, took advantage of the tide, and made it ashore. Of course, it's more likely that they succumbed to hypothermia, however, and drowned in the icy waters around the prison. Whatever the case may be, John, Clarence, and Frank were never seen again, for the most part. Here's the thing. There was a vehicle stolen the night of the escape by 3 men not too far from where the escapees would have landed, and among the supposed clues is a 1975 photo allegedly from Brazil showing 2 of the men. What we're saying here is there's a chance they made it. At his trial, Sylvester Matuszka claimed that he liked seeing people die, to the point of getting sexual gratification from it. But killing just 1 person at a time wasn't enough, and so he engineered train wrecks to kill many people at once. If you've never heard of him before, don't feel bad. You see, he was born in 1892, and Matuszka trained as a mechanical engineer and may have been an explosive specialist in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. Matuszka later worked in the mining industry, but soon realized that his true passion was derailing trains. His first couple of wrecks only caused injuries, although the third killed 22 people. After that, he was finally caught and charged for his crimes. Matuszka fully admitted to what he had done, even suggesting that God told him to do it, and it was later reported that he had enjoyed a sexual thrill from seeing so many people hurt or killed. Matuszka's initial death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He was still in prison at the end of World War II, and after that, no one knows what happened to him. What is known is that he was hoping to hook up with the Soviets as they rolled into the prison grounds. Matuszka may have worked as an explosives expert for the Russians at the end of the war, and some rumors suggest that he fought with the Chinese during the Korean War. Whatever he ended up doing, all we have are whispers, as Matuszka was never seen again. When you think of Prohibition, you probably think of American gangsters slinging hooch on the New Jersey boardwalk.
Nothing says I'm sorry like money.
But the US wasn't the only country to go dry. Alcohol was also illegal in Canada in the early 20th century. Just like their US counterparts, many Canadian gangsters realized they could make a lot of dough by smuggling liquor. At one point, bootleggers were making around $1 million a month. One Italian immigrant named Rocco Perri found a lucrative niche for himself in Prohibition-era Canada. Known as the Whiskey King, Perri was at the top of his game. He ran gambling houses all over Toronto and was big in the counterfeit money racket. That was until he vanished off the face of the earth. If he was killed, no one ever found the body, and if he walked off into a new life, he did a pretty dang good job of it. In 1944, Perri disappeared in Hamilton, Ontario after heading out for a walk. 70 years later, no one knows for sure what happened to him, but his biographer likes to think he was tipped off about a plot to kill him and used his connections to flee to the US. There's a letter addressed to his cousin that certainly makes it seem that he escaped to America and hid out there in relative obscurity. Aribert Heim worked as a doctor in Nazi concentration camps during World War II, where he earned the nickname Dr. Death. Unfortunately, he managed to escape after the war ended and went on to become one of the world's most wanted Nazi war criminals. During his time at the Nazi camps, Heim was accused of experimenting on healthy humans, including taking organs out of living victims and leaving them to die on the operating table. He was also known to inject poison into the hearts of his victims. After the war, Heim was thought to have escaped to Latin America. As it turned out, he actually continued living in Germany until the 1960s. When the authorities closed in on him, he fled to Egypt, where he converted to Islam. Neighbors there knew him as Tariq Hussein Farid, an unassuming man who would never let anyone photograph him. In the end, Heim was never caught. He died of cancer in 1992.